Algorithms, child abuse, domestic violence, scams, extremist material, mis- and disinformation, and the availability of good journalism on social media. These are all areas identified by the government for investigation as part of a new parliamentary committee investigating the influence and impacts of social media on Australian society.
Why do you think this year in particular there has been this renewed focus on, I guess, the responsibility of platforms and what those responsibilities look like to audiences?
Well, I think the first thing to say before diving into the big events of 2024 is that it's not just about what's happened in the last couple of months. The law and politics traditionally takes a little bit of time to catch up to the big issues facing our society. We know that policy change takes time, and that could be months or years. And I guess we've known about these risks that social media can have on our lives for many years now. I mean, you and I have talked on this podcast a number of times over the last couple of years of some big moments and some big issues. But 2024 has undoubtedly been a big year in social media.
Yeah.
So
Why though?
Well, in January and February this year, the CEOs of Meta, TikTok, and X testified before the US Senate Judiciary Committee on the dangers facing children on social media. And that included this spectacular moment where Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Meta, actually physically turned around to apologize to the families of children who had died by suicide because of social media. We've also had questions raised about TikTok's ownership and connections to the Chinese government. And again, in the US, Capitol Hill threatened to ban the app if it was not transferred to American ownership. TikTok is now suing the US government over that law. And then here in Australia, we've had this very public battle play out between Meta and legacy news companies after Meta withdrew some financial payments it was making annually to large media companies. It also announced to the global market that it would deprioritize the recommendation of political content to keep up what it says is changing consumer behavior on their apps.
Okay, that was a whole lot of jargon, but essentially all you were saying there was that Meta's basically said it's going to move away from news.
Exactly.
In no uncertain terms, and that it's not being recommended to users on Meta. That's all that's trying to say.
Definitely.
And that's something we've spoken about a lot, and I think that I will probably collapse if I have to talk about it again on this podcast, or we will move forward quickly.
But I haven't even mentioned the Elon Musk fight with the Australian E-Safety Commissioner. That's about the Wakely stabbing, videos of that stabbing being taken down on X. So it's been a really busy year for social media in a policy and government context especially.
And many of these events aren't necessarily linked. So we're kind of seeing, governments try and regulate social media ownership in one space, but then regulate what's on those platforms in another, then regulate how they can pay publishers in another. But I guess the common thread that is bringing all of these things together is that governments around the world want social media companies to take more responsibility, rightly or wrongly, for the impacts of their platforms and for the audiences that are on those platforms.
That's right. And that brings us to why we're talking about it today, because on Friday, the Minister for Communications, Michelle Rowland, and the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, announced this joint parliamentary committee into the impacts of social media on Australia.
And so that's an inquiry that's being led by a committee in Parliament, which is basically just a group that's made up of different parliamentarians from across the political divide. What's that committee actually looking into?
Well, here's how Anthony Albanese framed the mission of that committee on Friday.
But with social media comes the need for social licence and a social responsibility, whether it be the issue of domestic violence, whether it be radicalisation of our young people. Something that keeps popping up over and over again is the role of social media, which can be very positive but can also have a negative influence which is there. How do we make sure that social media's benefits continue whilst the potential for harmful impacts are minimised?
So there's a lot of different topics there. What are they actually hoping to achieve?
Ultimately, the committee's lens through which it's approaching its inquiries is this key idea of, as you said before, responsibility and accountability. The key premise there is if a platform has a significant reach and control over what Australians consume online, as these major social media players do, it should be subject to appropriate scrutiny. And a big part of that is going to be looking at algorithms. What responsibilities do algorithms have in terms of scams or illegal content?
Hello, I'm James and I produce the video you're watching. If you're enjoying what you're watching, we'd love it if you considered subscribing and checking us out on our other platforms. It'd really help in getting the word out about what we're doing here at TDA. Thanks very much, and now back to the deep dive.
I mean, I think this is a novel concept, but I think it's just such an interesting dynamic to see play out because these social media companies are private companies and can not entirely be compelled to do that much. That's what we've seen here with Meta, is that if they are pushed to do something, they will just withdraw from the market altogether. How does the government envision this committee will actually achieve those outcomes?
Well, there was some language in Michelle Rowland's press release on Friday that was really around systems. So they're asking the committee to recommend ways that we can bake into the way our government runs methods to keep these companies accountable. So it's not necessarily that the committee is only looking at what do we need to do right now to make sure that they're accountable in 2024, but how can we deal with this going forward? I mean, social media is not going anywhere, and I think the government really knows that. So they're looking for ways, systems, processes to keep them accountable moving forward years and decades.
I think it's interesting. In almost every scenario, Australia is behind many other nations in the world in how we approach certain issues, just, much smaller population size, whatever else. When it comes to relationships with big tech, though, the News Media Bargaining Code, which is what regulates the relationship between big tech and media, that was a world first at the time. And that was seen as like breaking new ground. Is the government seeing this as some sort of revolutionary new idea?
It's an interesting one. I mean, the government really thinks it is on the front of the charge towards social media regulation. Michelle Rowland said on Friday to the ABC, the world is looking at Australia right now. So they clearly do feel a responsibility to lead reform in this space, not just wait for other governments to lead the way. But the undertone to this discussion is the fact that these are global companies and these are global issues. And we've seen
one government can't regulate if another one.
Exactly. And so whether Australia goes first and tries to regulate what's happening in Australia, that question is always going to hang over this discussion.
And what has the opposition said here? Because, again, sorry to keep harping on about the media bargaining code, but that was the coalition's policy. So they have made attempts to regulate big tech in the past. What do they think about this newest inquiry?
So we heard from the Shadow Communications Minister, David Coleman, on Friday. He accused the government of being, quote, addicted to inquiring. Instead, he was calling for the implementation of age verification trials for social media platforms. So essentially to ensure that kids under 13 aren't on social media. We talked about that in the context of porn passports. I'll put a link to that episode in today's show notes. Coleman said that excluding social media platforms such as Instagram and TikTok from an age verification trial was outrageous.
So the opposition is really narrowing in there on one of the ways that you can combat some of the issues that we're seeing on social media.
To keep children safe, children shouldn't be on there is basically that.
Okay, but the government's taking a broader view of the issue and seeing what else can be done. This is a pressing issue. We've seen that in the dealings of the e-safety commissioner with Elon Musk and with, the immensely distressing videos we've seen on social media, with the stories that we see in the news. What happens from here? Committees historically and traditionally take a very long time to do their jobs. So how long are we expected to wait for any sort of recommendations from this committee?
They do take a long time, and there's an air around this committee that it's going to try and do its work relatively quickly when we talk in committee speak. So we're expecting a report from the committee by the end of 2024. It's going to be this week that the terms of reference, which are kind of the specifics to the committee.
It's the outline. It's the architecture of what they're looking at.
So that's going to be presented to Parliament in the next couple of days, and that will really set the wheels in motion. From there, we'll have hearings, then they'll write a report, then we'll get the report.
Well, if anyone who is sitting on that committee is listening to this podcast, we would be more than happy to rock up at a hearing and let you know about what we think about regulating social media and news. Until that time, though, thanks for joining us on the Daily Oz today. If you enjoyed today's episode, you can always let us know by either clicking 5 stars on Apple or Spotify or leaving a review on either of those platforms. We so appreciate your support, and we'll be back again tomorrow.